The death of James Steerforth is the final cataclysm of David Copperfield and the catalyst of one of the most heart-wrenching Dickensian scenes of mourning. The compound tragedy of the scene is cemented by Ham's death and his valiant but in vain rescue efforts, and by the subsequent revelation of Steerforth's seduction of Rosa Dartle in what the narrator calls, quote, the irremediable past. The death of David Copperfield's first friend is a painful aporia within the novel due to David's struggle to square Steerforth's self-interested betrayals with his formative mentorship. Critics have long read Steerforth's life and death as a comment on the demise of the romantic aesthetics and politics of the previous generation, personified through the tragic, callous, Byronic hero. But beyond his Byronic characterization, Steerforth exemplifies a larger trend within Dickens's work to nostalgically valorize the departed masculinities of previous generations for their power and eccentricity, as reflected in other Dickensian figures like Fezziwig or Mr. Turveydrop. This talk will explore how Dickens expresses a larger sense of historical and generational loss through Steerforth's death. First, I'll present a reading of the death scene centered thematically around the unattainable almost it presents as the novel's last dividing line between past and present. Next, I'll ground this analysis in David's long relationship with Steerforth, which begins with representations of archaic patronage that the novel carries until the end. Lastly, this talk will end with a comparison to other characters who broadly illustrate Dickens's nostalgic appreciation for the English past, especially the long 18th century. Steerforth's death anchors the last tragic arc of Dickens's most directly autobiographical novel. David introduces it as, quote, an event so indelible, so awful, so bound by an infinite variety of ties to all that has preceded it, end quote, as to extend its shadow retroactively over the narrator's childhood and into the present. Indeed, we see the storm that will swallow Steerforth, Ham, and so many others foreshadowed in the night sky as David departs the Steerforth Manor for the penultimate time. Mrs. Steerforth and Rosa Dartle look out the valley below where, quote, a mist was rising like a sea, which, mingling with the darkness, made it seem as if the gathering waters would encompass them. Before I looked upon those two again, a stormy sea had risen to their feet, end quote. This once-in-a-generation storm is monumental in its size and fury. For miles inland, quote, every sheet and puddle lashed its banks, end quote, while, quote, the waves on the horizon, caught at intervals above the rolling abyss, were like glimpses of another shore with towers and buildings, end quote. So great is the coming calamity that will sweep Steerforth and so many others aside that it seemingly provides a merest glimpse of the fallen world to come. David is sure that, quote, the tremendous sea itself, end quote, and its high watery walls will, quote, undermine the earth, end quote, by washing away the roots of human life. The schooner, laden with fruits and wine, carrying Steerforth home from Iberia, arrives several days into this cataclysmic storm, going down on a nearby beach. David rushes to the scene through a storm that rages like the sound of a deafening cannonade, as if it's a great battle. The war with the wild sea has been hopelessly lost, and our last glimpse of Steerforth alive is, quote, the active figure with the curling hair, end quote, who clings to the ship's last mast as it tantalizingly resurfaces. Steerforth waves goodbye with a singular red cap, though David still hasn't completely recognized him. But it's clear that this is the last chance, and Ham wades into the churning water, quote, rising with the hills, falling with the valleys, lost beneath the rugged foam, borne in towards the shore, borne on towards the ship, striving hard and valiantly. The distance was nothing, but the power of the sea and wind made the strife deadly, end quote. One stride away from salvation, Ham, Steerforth, and the entire wreck are annihilated by a quote, high, green, vast hillside of water, end quote, which Ham seemed to leap up and into, quote, with a mighty bound, end quote. And then all is lost, save insignificant fragments of wood in the water, quote, as if a mere cask had been broken, end quote. Ham's body, crushed by the wave, is recovered relatively quickly, but Steerforth washes up later, near where the Peggotty cottage once stood, and David says, quote, among the ruins of the home he had wronged, I saw him lying with his head upon his arm, as I had often seen him lie at school, end quote. So ends James Steerforth, the only villain of David Copperfield, as John Gordon notes, quote, or sorry, not quote, to face fatal punishment for his transgressions, but also the only one to be exalted by the narrator despite it all. Though Steerforth's death, or through Steerforth's death, Dickens's narrator mourns an ill-fated, anachronistic, adventurous masculinity, despite his faults and excesses. And now, some more about what Steerforth means to the narrator. The novel's first line, quote, whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life or whether that station will be held by anybody else, these pages must show, end quote, famously leaves David's protagonism an open question, but the last clause of the sentence is less equivocal. The textual record, for all its imperfections and omissions, should show true and preserve what has been lost. The loss of Steerforth weighs heavily upon David's psyche to the point that he remains the narrator's hero in the classical and Byronic senses. Heroism to David denotes a spectacular progression through life as a series of aesthetic encounters, and fittingly, the narrator never completely moves past his enduring fascination with Steerforth, while David later agrees with Rose's assessment that the absolute freedom granted to Steerforth by his mother and by the world more generally allotted his transgressions. The extent to which David actually condemns him is debatable, for the narrator usually remains silent on the subject. Though he is acutely aware of Steerforth's betrayals, especially his predation of Emily, David retains unpayable debt and unshakable loyalty to his first patron. To him, Steerforth will always posthumously appear in his initial role as ring giver. This role emerges in their first meeting, which marks the end of David's, miserable first months at Salem House, where he says, quote, I was not considered as being formally received into the school, end quote, until Steerforth had taken notice of him, and that every prior interaction he had at Salem House felt like being a prisoner before the magistrate. So in this first meeting, Steerforth convinces David to part with his allowance of 7 shillings, which buys a, quote, royal spread, end quote, of currant wine and cakes that, with David's encouragement, the older boy dispenses to the group with, quote, perfect fairness, end quote. This scene is a loyalty ritual initiating David into this schoolboy group and more broadly into Steerforth's service. It's both the first positive experience David has had in a long time and one that'll prove enduringly formative to the narrator's identity and vocation. David's first foray into storytelling is the nightly recitation of his inherited trove of 18th century novels, which includes many of Dickens's favorites, like the picaresque novels of Tobias Smollett, for Steerforth's benefit. They, quote, make some regular Arabian Nights of it, end quote, and in return, David receives academic help and companionship. He flourishes for the first time here, though the middle-aged narrator is quick to add, quote, I was moved by no interested or selfish motive, nor was I moved by fear of him. I admired and loved him, and his approval was return enough, end quote. This denial of exchange shows both David's lingering affection and this relationship's aesthetic foundation in quasi-feudal class politics, illustrating a nostalgia for what Elaine Hadley calls the, quote, deferential culture, end quote, of pre-industrial Britain. At some level, David Copperfield will always be Steerforth's Shahrazad, and the novel consistently presents the doomed, rakish aristocrat, good and bad, in regal terms. We see ample evidence of his caprice and arbitrary exercise of power beyond the main affair of Emily's seduction, including his exile of Mr. Mell and his youthful disfigurement and abandonment of Rosa Dartle. Steerforth consistently treats his inferiors poorly, and the narrator's perspective is warped by David's elegy for his friend and the spectacular, callous, aristocratic masculinity he represented. Most of Dickens's depictions of anachronistic characters rooted in the tropes of the 18th and early 19th centuries do less harm than Steerforth, often being fondly remembered oddities. In 1866, author and editor John Timms published English Eccentrics and Eccentricities, a mostly non-fictional volume recounting the biographies of many of London's weirdest personalities of the previous few generations. Timms's preface describes the object of his volume, quote, to show that with oddity of character may coexist much goodness of heart, end quote. Dickens, whose work had been in vogue for decades by 1866, explored similar ideas through characters like Fezziwig, Jarvis Lorry, Mr. Turveydrop, Mr. Dick, Betsy Trotwood, and others. His historical novels, Barnaby Rudge and A Tale of Two Cities, and the quirky characters that more broadly inhabit his work, received a fair amount of criticism for various anachronisms and or quintessentially Dickensian character tics, often justifiably, but these aspects of Dickens's work demonstrate a genuine enthusiasm for England's past and its lost personalities. I'll conclude by returning to David Copperfield and our discussion of Steerforth's death through a brief note about the whimsical, childish, and wise artist Mr. Dick. Mr. Dick's labors on his unfinishable memorial are interrupted and interpolated by the ghostly severed head of King Charles I, David's aunt Betsy Trotwood, Mr. Dick's partner, and herself a relic of 18th century eccentric rationalism, tellingly explicates the phantom head as, quote, his allegorical way of expressing it. He connects his illness with great disturbance and agitation naturally, and that's the figure or the simile or whatever it's called which he chooses to use, and why shouldn't he if he thinks proper, end quote. This endorsement of authorial license frames Mr. Dick as Dickens's third proxy in the novel, rounding out the two David Copperfields. Mr. Dick is an unworldly artist engaging in free association to offset the trauma of his favorite sister's subjugation by her husband, who, quote, made her wretched, end quote, like Steerforth had done to Emily and Rosa and Mr. Murdstone to Claire and Copperfield. The middle-aged narrator is more industrious and worldly than Mr. Dick, but he too is haunted by his own severed regal head. Steerforth's formative example that clouds his life and labors. Thank you.